Hi, everyone. We are waiting on a few more, but we will probably get started just in the essence of time to make sure that we are recognizing that you are giving up your Wednesday evening. So thank you for joining us this evening. As you will note, everyone is muted just to ensure that we don't have lots of background noise running. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping things and then we will get started. So actually, then I'll pass it off to Skylar and then we will get started. Let's just give me 1 second here. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I think everyone does know me, but I'm Talitha McCloskey. I am one of the co-founders along with Skylar and our moms, Gwen and Marlene, of Raise Her Community. Our LeadHER Circle this evening is Breaking the Silence, and the purpose of this specific circle is to support Domestic Violence Month by bringing awareness to the ever-present emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical abuse that women and men in Regina and Saskatchewan face, and so how we as individuals and a community can be a part of the solution. So for tonight's event, Breaking the Silence, you'll be hearing from 3 local allies of gender-based violence who work in organizations that are dedicated to helping women live a violence-free life. Before diving into this LeadHER Circle this evening, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the history, land, and people of this area that we are broadcasting from on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional land and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and commit to reconciliation through listening, seeking to understand, and through growing strong together. Our Raise Her community is committed to supporting women in our community and in this journey. So for the agenda and flow of the evening, we will have 3 presentations, and each presentation will be about 20 minutes long. We will be using the chat function to post questions. So during any of the presentations, if you do have a question, please just type it right into the chat. And then at the very end, after the 3 presentations, we will go through the questions one by one, either directing it right to the person, or if it's just an overall question, we can have all 3 speakers answer it as well. So please put those questions in the chat as soon as they come up, and then we will go through them at the end. You are currently on mute, again, as I've already said, and we ask that you just keep yourself on mute. And we would like the presenters to obviously have their cameras on. You don't have to have your camera on if you don't want to. It's really up to you. For everyone else, I mean, the presenters, please keep your cameras on. And we will be recording a session, just again, so you are aware. And like I said, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So in support of that, all the proceeds from this event will be split between the 3 organizations we are working with this evening. So that is Regina Transition House, SOFIA House, and Regina Sexual Assault Centre. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Skylar to do a little bit of an introduction of Raise Her Community, and then she will introduce our speakers as well.
All right. Hi, guys. So like Julie said, I'm Skylar. And for those of you who don't know much about Raise Her, I think many of you do, but for those of you who don't, Raise Her Community is a for impact intergenerational movement that Talitha and I created with our mothers, Gwen and Marlene, women supporting women to become leaders in their communities. And we do this through an online membership wherein we provide our members with the access to our online member space where they have a variety of tools and resources for professional and personal development. We do these monthly events, LeadHER Circles, where we showcase and feature our members and give them a chance to exercise their leadership skills by facilitating and speaking at these events, which are always based on a variety of topics that are centered around women supporting women and female leadership. And we have biannual conferences. These days they're looking more virtual, and that's really that opportunity to connect with like-minded people that you wouldn't necessarily meet in your normal circles and figure out ways that you can support others. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. For every 10 memberships purchased, 1 is donated to a deserving person who demonstrates financial need for one. So if you have any other questions or want to know anything else about Raise Her Community, visit our website at www.raiseherco.com, or you can follow us online on social media at Raise Her Co. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into the speakers and introduce you to these three amazing women. So first off, we have Stephanie Taylor, if you want to give a wave, Stephanie. So Stephanie is the executive director of the Regina Transition House, and she's also a registered social worker with a master's degree from the University of Regina. Her practicums, research work, and volunteer community experience began in 2001 and has focused on women's issues, violence against women, and harm reduction with vulnerable groups. Her thesis titled Violence Prevention with Street Workers, Participatory Action Research within SWAP was published in 2008. And her paid career from 2005 to 2016 was spent working with high-risk youth in various capacities, with some work in the provincial government's Child and Family Services Department. She assumed the role of executive director in her dream job at the Regina Transition House in January of 2017. Her other community interests in recent years to current day include fostering rescue puppies with Lucky Paws and developing Twinkle Star Project, Inc., an NGO providing and coordinating perinatal loss services and events. She lives in the Regina Cathedral area with her husband, Carmen, and their beloved dog and cat. Next, we have Tmira, if you want to give a wave. Tmira Marchment. She is the executive director of SOFIA House, which is also located in Regina. She has previously worked in the Ministry of Social Services in both leadership and management roles, as well as frontline worker roles. Tmira has completed both her bachelor's and master's of social work at the University of Regina, and she's on the board of the Provincial Association of Transition Houses of Saskatchewan, and is a sessional lecturer at the University of Regina. So welcome, Tmira. And last but not least, we have Moravia de la O, and she is a master's level clinical social worker and counselor at the Regina Sexual Assault Centre. In her role, she provides individual and group counseling services to youth and adults impacted by sexual and domestic violence. Before joining the Regina Sexual Assault Centre, she supported immigrant women experiencing domestic violence in Regina and survivors of sexual violence, childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, and human trafficking in Austin, Texas. She has also over a decade of experience in advocacy and research on human rights issues in the Americas. So welcome, Moravia. So welcome all of our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Today, we're so excited to learn about what your organizations are up to in support of women, helping them live violence-free, and how we as a community can support you in supporting them. So I'm gonna jump right into it. First up, we have a presentation from Stephanie Taylor from the Regina Transition House, who will jump right in and, like I say, put those questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the very end. So I'm going to pass it off to Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be invited to speak, and I don't have any fancy PowerPoint or anything, so it'll just be me talking for the next 20 minutes. So basically, as Skylar mentioned, I'm the executive director for Regina Transition House. And Regina Transition House, if you're not aware, is a women's shelter. So we are emergency, we accept women and children on emergency basis. And most of our calls come through the crisis line, and some come through the police and mobile crisis or social services. Basically, we take people around the clock 24/7. We have, our max capacity is 27 people, and spread out through 8 rooms in the shelter. We do have the capability of taking, we are a wheelchair accessible facility, or a facility that is able to accommodate people with mobility issues. But we only have 1 room that is able to do that. Basically, the different types of violence that there's sort of like 3 categories of violence and abuse that we typically look at in terms of prioritizing when we bring in women and children. And women can come in on their own or with their children. And so basically, domestic violence is obviously the reason why the organization was developed and founded 44 years ago now. It's a very long-standing organization in the community. And domestic violence remains the main issue, or intimate partner violence remains the main issue in terms of what kind of women and what kind of experiences we're seeing and working with. We have also kind of expanded more explicitly to cover women leaving community violence, so which could be gang violence or sexual exploitation, as well as family conflict, which we see as women coming from situations where it's not intimate partner violence, it's not exploitation, it's conflict with family members for whatever reason in the household that they would typically reside in. So a lot of times women who are leaving abuse, who are like younger women who are from immigrant families, that might be kind of like the more typical family conflict we would see, or elderly women who are fleeing abuse and violence from their adult children is something else that kind of falls under that umbrella. And so just to kind of give you some stats, to give you an idea of how many people we're working with in a year. Last year, we saw 329 people for the second year in a row, exact same amount of people, 329 people come through our doors. And 1,275 calls to our crisis line, or I guess not individual calls, but number of people needing space in those calls. And that was more than a 10% increase from the year prior. So demand is increasing, but we only have so much space. And we are basically functioning as, well, particularly before COVID happened, we were functioning at basically the fastest pace we could in terms of helping people effectively, while also trying to help as many people as possible. So what can a woman expect when she's staying at her shelter? I think, like, in general, there's always sort of like the basic pieces that we look at when a woman comes into shelter. And so that's always going to be domestic violence education or intimate partner violence education. We're going to be looking at any kind of health issues she may have, physical health issues. A lot of women come in, if they've been physically abused, they have immediate health needs. If she has children in her care, what the children need, what kind of assessments they may need, and services, supports. Same with the woman in terms of supports in the community that can help carry her through longer term, because our shelter, like I said, is an emergency shelter. And so the stay is usually about 3 weeks. And so that really doesn't give a woman a lot of time to heal, right? It's really kind of just a jumping off point. And while she is with us, she'll receive support counseling along with some of those other referrals, legal support, medical support. And we also do have therapeutic counseling available. So we have like a clinical social worker that comes in on a weekly basis and on an emergent basis to provide counseling services to women who would like that. And it's quite popular since we've started that. And most women will connect with our outreach program before leaving and continue to access our outreach services anywhere from a month to a year or more, depending on what their needs are after they've left the shelter. And our outreach program offers a weekly support group for women, along with group programming for their children. And it also offers individualized meetings with our outreach worker on an as-needed basis, someone who's going to follow up on any referrals that were made while they were staying in the shelter. Someone who can help them cope with crisis as it emerges again in their lives when they're out in the community and established in their new housing, which is also a feature of something that we would work on with them while they stay at the shelter, is helping them find hopefully stable, affordable housing. A lot of our, we do try to make as many referrals as possible to like SOFIA House, so Tmira, Tmira's organization. And there's just simply not enough second stage shelters available in our region to accommodate the need there. I mean, some women just end up in, based on their income, in kind of room and board situations, which aren't the best, aren't the safest often, and often they're back with us in a matter of time. So so I guess like some of the other interesting projects that we've been working on to help promote like further women's healing so that they're getting more out of their stay with us and hopefully preventing additional stays. We are going to be piloting a program called Attach out of, developed by a professor at the University of Calgary in conjunction with the Calgary Children's Hospital. And so we're going to be piloting a group of women through our outreach program, and SOFIA House is going to be partnering with us on that. And it will basically help women with small children. I believe the cutoff is like age 6, maybe even a little younger, in terms of helping regulate their learning skills to help regulate their emotions. Because once all these women have experienced trauma, and the trauma will impact how they parent and how well they can regulate their emotions when coping with parenting their young children. And that can consequently transfer to the child and have long-term impacts for the child. So this is really a preventative program that we're going to be trying out. And hopefully it's something that works well for our organizations, and we can continue to help do some more preventative work. So we're seeing fewer returns to shelter and maybe fewer intergenerational impacts, where we're seeing kids of women who have been in the shelter down the line coming into shelter on their own because they are now in violent and abusive situations. Some other interesting programming we're starting up recently is we noticed there was a high need in our preteen girls in the outreach program and teen girls who are experiencing issues of self-harm, low self-esteem, and struggling with beginning to use substances. And so because of that need that our children's support worker identified, we are now developing, and we'll just be starting in November, a weekly offering of a preteen and teen group curriculum for our outreach kids. So any kids that have come here with their mom can then access this programming. So we're hoping it'll be successful, and it will be offered to the girls and boys, not just the girls, even though the need was initially identified with the girls. But we want to make sure the boys are included from those families as well, so that they're still involved in all those same conversations about healthy relationships and healthy self-esteem and emotional expression. So we're really excited about starting that up. I think another piece I was going to talk about was just sort of like I mean, not everyone comes into a shelter when they're experiencing intimate partner violence or abuse. So how can you, as a friend or family member, help someone who may not be willing to come into a shelter, may not be able to if the shelters are full, may not see that as a resource that they need necessarily. Maybe they have a large support network that they can rely on. Because most of the women that come through our doors, they're coming through our doors because of their economic situation and their lack of healthy support systems. But there's many, many women in other demographics that are experiencing violence and abuse that just have a different socioeconomic situation. So how can you reach out to someone who may be in that type of situation, or maybe in a situation that they need to come into a shelter? So if you see some of the signs of violence and abuse, kind of even a good pointer is if you see any of it kind of coming out into her personal life when other people are present, you can only imagine what's happening behind closed doors. Usually that's just a small glimpse. If you're seeing some controlling behaviors, if you're seeing someone who's putting their partner down, doesn't treat them with respect, just some of those tiny red flags, if you're seeing just some of that in front of others, there's probably a lot more going on behind closed doors. And I mean, I think we need to be able to have those conversations more frequently with people we care about if we see them, out of caring and concern. And so it's not such a shameful topic. There's such a shame around talking about intimate partner violence and abuse still. And people don't want to share that part of their lives, even if they have questions or they're not sure, am I experiencing a healthy relationship, right? So just kind of being able to initiate that conversation with them and not to be judgmental. So if you're initiating that conversation, or if they're initiating that conversation with you, don't be judgmental, especially even if it's like the woman is saying, or the person is saying, I'm just thinking of maybe leaving, or I just am wondering if what I'm experiencing is okay. Just be a sounding board and try not to insert your own opinion about their partner, or say, try not to insert your own opinion about, well, if that was me, I would be getting out of there right now and I would never go back, right? It's about what's right for them and where they're at. And of course, always reinforcing that safety is the most important thing, because usually violence escalates and safety then can become a factor. Or someone's mental health, mental well-being is easily, very quickly affected by even emotional and psychological abuse. So then they may be at risk for doing, for putting themselves at risk. So there's lots of factors to consider. So non-judgmental, let's say you have a friend who leaves a partner that has mistreated them and returns, again, non-judgmental. Be that person who could still be there for them, regardless of the outcome, because they still need that support network. Without a support network, something awful could happen and they will have nowhere to turn, right? Or they will think they will have nowhere to turn. But with a support network, at least they know there's someone who isn't going to judge them, even if they've gone back many times and the same thing has happened. And the other thing is, if someone is planning to leave a partner and they've asked you for advice, or they've asked you to be part of that plan, so important to keep that confidential, never to discuss it in a way that might alert their partner that they are planning to leave, so that they become aware and stop the plan or hurt them out of anger because they find out that they're planning to leave them, right? Women are much more at risk of severe violence when they are leaving or have just left a relationship. Even if, say, physical violence wasn't necessarily a factor before, all of a sudden you might see some threatening physical violence behaviors, stalking behaviors, things like that happening when she's leaving. So I think basically, yeah, that was my time. I went 25 minutes. Sorry. And yeah, I'm going to pass it off back to Skylar, I guess.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. I already have a bunch of questions, but I'm saving them for the end, so writing them all down. But yes, great discussion, and so many good points and takeaways for all of us as well. So, all right, I'm going to pass it off to Tmira to get started, and she does have a presentation here, so let her share her screen.
Okay, is it working now? Oh, okay. There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm really fortunate to be here, and I hope that everyone can learn some things tonight and we can have a good discussion. So before I talk about SOFIA House specifically, I just wanted to spend a bit of time talking about second stage shelters, because what I've found since being in this role is that a lot of people don't actually know the differences between, crisis shelters and second stage shelters, and that can help with our discussions and the awareness of resources in our community as well. So second stage shelters like SOFIA House are often thought of as the next step in the continuum of services that are available to people who are fleeing violence. Second stage shelters can offer long-term, so for example, at SOFIA House, up to 2 years, private accommodation, so everybody gets their own apartment in a secure building with programs and services available right on site. So what Stephanie was talking about at Transition House, that's an emergency shelter, a very important piece of that continuum where people can go, immediately in the middle of the night. Second stage is kind of that next step, so where they could go after if they're still needing that security and support. So they don't have to leave the building in order to get the programs and services at SOFIA House. So SOFIA House specifically is a second stage shelter for women and their children who've experienced violence, and we offer 20 fully furnished apartment suites over 2 buildings, and also programming space for families. SOFIA House provides safe, stable housing for these families for up to 2 years, and that's not a hard or fast rule. We have extended that. If people need to stay longer, we have certainly done so. SOFIA House also provides supports, referrals, and in-house individual and group counseling for women and children. So SOFIA House has been around for over 35 years now, and we have always had just the one building with the 10 apartment suites. So in July of this year, through a new partnership with Ivana, we were able to expand to a second building. So we now have 20 apartment suites and programming and office space as well over 2 buildings in the city of Regina. So we're very happy we were able to expand, because as you'll see coming up, and what Stephanie's already mentioned, the demand is very great. So a little bit more about our programming at SOFIA House. One facet of our programming is our women's programming, and this is delivered by the Women's Program Coordinator. It consists of both individual and group counseling for the women in the house. So we have every Tuesday night, there's group counseling for all the women, and then we have individual one-on-one counseling as well. So this counseling is individualized based on the person, depending on their case plan, what they're wanting to, learn more about, where they're wanting to grow. Common themes can include things like education around IPV itself, work around boundaries, looking at things like assertiveness, self-esteem, healthy relationships, anxiety, and mental health. Those are just a few of the topics that we can cover. We also provide advocacy and support with legal, medical, and financial matters. Case plans can mature and grow over the 2 years that women reside at SOFIA House. We also have a lot of partnerships in the community. So a lot of our referrals will come from Transition House or the YWCA Isabel Johnson Shelter, the WISH Shelter. So typically, people would come into a crisis shelter, they would be there for a little bit to get settled. They would start thinking about some next steps in terms of long-term housing. They would then call us, we'd set up an intake, we'd sit down and meet with them. We also partner with Family Service Regina, Kids First, Reach, and many more. We also offer children's programming at SOFIA House. This is delivered by our children's program coordinator, and the programming focuses on preventative education and counseling for children who've experienced violence. This also includes one-on-one counseling sessions as well as group counseling sessions. So on the Tuesday nights when the women are having their group, the kids are having their group as well in a different area. We tend to focus on individual and group counseling topics such as coping strategies, life skills, and healthy relationships. We also have things like our chill zone, for example, which provides a safe place after school where children can complete their homework, visit with counselors, and just make friends with other children in the shelter. what we have found is that the kids in the shelter really tend to stick together. They often go to the same school, so it's very nice to see those friendships grow and they can learn about healthy relationships and healthy friendships together. The children at SOFIA House range right from infancy to the age of 17, allowing our children's program coordinator to work with a variety of ages and developmental levels. We also have partnerships with many people in the community with our children's programming. We work with REACH to provide cooking classes for older children, Families First, Kids First, and the YWCA. In terms of our other areas of programming, we also offer an employment program. This is a new program that we've been piloting the last 2 years. We partnered with an Indigenous facilitator to develop an employment program for Indigenous women who face barriers to employment. I do want to know that this year, I want you guys to be aware that we have opened it up, not only just to women who are residing at SOFIA House, but to anyone who faces barriers to employment. And we have opened that up as well to other cultures because we were seeing a lot of immigrant women coming in and looking for our services that wanted to be a part of this employment program as well. So during this programming, there's a classroom component. There's also a certification component. So they would learn, Microsoft Office, WMIS, Food Safe, all of those certifications are provided to them. And then we used to have work placements, but because of COVID in this particular section, we aren't able to do that right now. And then we provide childcare and the cultural programming as well. So in addition to our employment program, we also provide advocacy. This, on a larger level is a big part of my job as the executive director, talking about the barriers that women face that are facing violence in our society. But on our counselor level too, they very often advocate with income assistance, with child protection, or other agencies as needed. We can also support the women just in terms of attending court or other appointments or transportation and anything else our residents need. In terms of our staffing structure, I'll just go through really quickly. We just have the one executive director, myself. We have a program manager. We have 4 women's program coordinators who complete our women's programming. So we have 2 at each building. And then we have 2 children's program coordinators, so 1 at each building, along with 2 part-time cleaners, 1 at each building, which is very helpful during COVID. And then we also have volunteers for our children's programming, and I'll talk a bit about that later as well. So in terms of our stats, what are we seeing? So last year, we helped 54 individuals. So this is women and children that came through SOFIA House doors. This year, obviously, we don't have our stats for this whole year, but for the current situation, what I can tell you right now is that we are full. So we have 20 apartments, as you know, all 20 apartments are full. So we have 20 women and we have 34 kids. We also have 16 families on our wait list. So we've just expanded to the second building. Both buildings are full and we have an additional 16 families on our wait list. So we could easily fill another building. The need is that great for long-term housing. I also wanted to touch a bit about COVID and interpersonal violence. So, I think that most of you have probably heard through the media, but we have seen, IPV is increasing during this pandemic. We have seen this in other countries, other provinces that are further ahead than us in this pandemic than we are, but it is very much increasing during this time of COVID. So for us specifically at SOFIA House, what we have seen is since March, since this pandemic began, we've completed over 70 intakes with families looking for safe and secure long-term housing with an average of only 1 space available for those 70 families. So the need is great and it's only going to rise. I also wanted to touch a little bit about the link between women, IPV, and homelessness. So aside from the very needed security in the long term, second stage shelters can also help bridge the link between violence and housing. It's very important to note that women are most likely to lose their housing than men are due to violence. And research shows that violence is commonly cited as the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. A recent Canadian study found that 38% of women reported experiencing homelessness immediately after separating from her partner. Therefore, having safe, secure, and supportive housing can change the lives of these women and the future of their children. There's also a huge link between long-term housing, women, homelessness, and interpersonal violence, and coming up with solutions to combating some of these high numbers in Saskatchewan. So having that long-term safe and affordable housing for women is critical for our families leaving violent situations. At SOFIA House, people only pay the social housing rates and income assistance rates for rent. So it is, as affordable housing can get right now in our province. Long-term supportive housing can be an aspect of a number of steps taken to help impact the high rates of IPV in our province. So in terms of some of the challenges that we're facing, funding is our #1 challenge due to a couple of things. So due to the lack of stable operational funding, so Saskatchewan is one of only 2 provinces in Canada whose government doesn't provide operational funding for second stage shelters. This is huge for us because without that stable operational funding, there's no way that we can expand further than what we already have expanded to. But we know that the need in the community is so great, and we could be expanding and housing many more families. So because we don't have that operational funding on an ongoing basis, we do operate on grants, contributions, and donations from the community. And in addition to this, we are facing significant challenges due to the pandemic, both on demand and space availability. So as I said earlier, there's just so much demand for long-term housing and for safe housing. There's also challenges when it comes to funding. We can't have in-person fundraisers like we used to. So more and more nonprofits are having to take their fundraising efforts online. For example, we're doing an online fundraising thing right now, and we're not anticipating to have, we would anticipate a lot more. How do you be able to do your banquets and your really large fundraisers? Moving things online has significantly slowed down donations. In terms of our successes, I just wanted to highlight some of the successes from our women and children that stay at SOFIA House. So we had asked, and in our current fundraiser as well, we asked residents if they would feel comfortable sharing their stories. So people have written down things that they would like other people to know. And in our videos on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, our staff have read it out so that the residents don't have to, appear on camera, but they wanted to share their stories. So this is just a couple quotes that we have received from our residents. So that is what we deem as success, is the residents that we are able to help at SOFIA House. So what can you do in terms of interpersonal violence as a whole? Stephanie has already talked about, when friends or family disclose this abuse, you need to, first of all, believe them. You need to be supportive without being judgmental. And, all of that piece that Stephanie shared is really good advice in order to help someone. Some of the other things you can do is become knowledgeable about the services in your community. So, tonight, for example, you're learning about Transition House, you're learning about SOFIA House, you're learning about the Sexual Assault Centre. If you know about those services in the community, then you can help someone if they are looking for somewhere to go. You can provide them with the phone numbers and give a little bit of background on what they do. You can also advocate for women's rights in your community. So just like you're doing tonight, you're part of this LeadHER Circle, becoming part of these groups and really learning how to share your voice is really important in our society today. You can also be an active ally. So there's a difference between saying that you're an ally, but actually being an active ally. So if you were, with a group of people and they're telling sexist jokes or racist jokes or something like that, that's an example where you can stand up and you can use your voice and you can really be an active ally in that situation. You can also volunteer in your community. So like I said, at SOFIA House, for example, we take volunteers to help out with our children's program, which is every Tuesday night, and we do a variety of activities with the children. Other crisis shelters and other agencies within the city will also take volunteers. I will be touch and go because of COVID, obviously, but being a volunteer is a great way to help your community. And lastly, you can donate. Like many other nonprofits, everybody's kind of in the same position where their funding dollars are likely going down, their donation dollars are going down. So that is another way you can help if you can't actively, volunteer your time. And that's it. We're saving questions till the end, so I will just leave the questions for now. But thank you very much for allowing me to present to you tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tmira. That was very enlightening, and it's disheartening at the same time just to hear all those stats. But thank you so much for preparing that for us. So, okay, we're gonna, last but not least, pass it off to Moravia to do her chat. And I believe she has a presentation as well.
All right, can everyone see that? Yep, all right. Okay, just gonna make sure I can see everyone. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to participate tonight in this forum and this panel. As Skylar already mentioned, my name is Moravia de la O, and I'm one of the counselors at the Regina Sexual Assault Centre. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the services we provide at the center, and more broadly about sexual violence, both just defining what sexual violence is, a little bit also talking about consent, what consent is, and then I'm also going to share a few stats about sexual violence in Canada and Saskatchewan, and some of the barriers that people face when reporting sexual assault. So yeah, so that's a bit about what I'll be doing. The Regina Sexual Assault Centre has been around since 1975. We were established as a drop-in center and counseling, providing counseling services to primarily women at that point. But as more men came forward requesting to access our services, we changed our name to be more inclusive of all of the community and everyone accessing services. And we provide services for anyone impacted by sexual violence. So this includes survivors of sexual violence, but also their families. So partners, parents, children of people who are experiencing or who have experienced sexual violence, siblings as well. We provide services to adults and children and youth. So in children ages 5 and up, youth and adults. Although the majority of our clients are adults, and most of them are women. Something that's, I think, a little bit unique about our services is that most of the people accessing our services are actually survivors of childhood sexual abuse, which doesn't mean that they haven't experienced other forms of sexual or interpersonal violence as adults, but that they have at least experienced childhood sexual abuse as well. And many of them have experienced other forms of sexual or interpersonal violence since. So just a little bit about the services that we provide. We provide a number of services from a trauma-informed perspective. One of the main services we provide is a confidential 24-hour crisis line that is in part supported by volunteers, by trained advocates who are volunteers, members of the community who help us answer the phones after hours and during the weekends. That crisis line is primarily for people who have experienced sexual violence, or their relatives or families or loved ones or friends as well. Anyone who would like to, who is wanting to chat with someone who's been trained to support survivors. They are our volunteers and staff also provide accompaniment to the police or to the hospital after someone has been sexually assaulted. So a lot of those survivors get connected to that support through our crisis line, but also through the hospital if they are asked if they would like to have some sort of accompaniment or have an advocate when they report or when they seek services at the hospital after a sexual assault. We also provide short and long-term counseling. So we have a team of 3 counselors, and we provide up to 25 sessions of counseling of individual counseling to survivors, their families, and other people impacted by sexual violence. We also sometimes see people who have also experienced domestic violence or interpersonal violence, but the majority of our clients have also experienced sexual violence. And we also provide group therapy. Right now, we're not running any groups just because of COVID, but we usually have a group in the winter, another one in the fall, and we've also had some summer groups, especially around gardening, using gardening as a therapeutic tool. And we also do a lot of public education, like I am doing today, to the community around sexual violence. And we also provide advocacy to our clients around issues of justice and accessing healthcare. So a little bit about what we do. So what is sexual violence? So sexual violence in general, as defined by the World Health Organization, is any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, or unwanted sexual comments or advances, or acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person, regardless of their relationship to the victim. And this applies in any setting, including the home and the workplace. So sexual violence involves, it's important to remember that sexual violence involves a whole spectrum of behaviors that are linked to our attitudes as a community and a society around sex, gender roles, race, ability, and sexual orientation. So there's different forms of sexual violence. We've been, as a community here in Regina, we've been talking a lot about sexual harassment since the summer. So that's one form of sexual violence, verbal sexual harassment, which is sort of falls under the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, and it's prohibited in schools and public institutions and workplaces, but it doesn't cover, our existing legal framework doesn't cover sexual harassment in public or in the home, unless it falls, in some very extreme cases, it could fall under the criminal code as criminal harassment, but usually that is very unusual. So I think people know that sexual harassment can include jokes, comments, requests for sexual favors, leering, nonverbal sounds, showing someone pornography, any threat or promises of exchange in exchange for sexual acts, and any comments also, not just related to sex itself, but that are pertaining to a person's sexuality and gender. And then there's also the physical aspect of sexual violence, which is primarily sexual assault. So sexual assault is any unwanted activity of a sexual nature. This can include sexual grabbing, kissing, fondling, as well as penetration with a body part or object. So it involves any sexual contact without your permission, which we call that consent. And it is any unwanted, like I said, kissing, fondling, touching, and it can also include any forced sexual intercourse, whether that's oral, anal, or vaginal. So an important aspect of sexual assault is that it doesn't have consent. So it's any sexual contact without a person's consent. And consent can be a tricky topic to understand. I think it's one of the things that is most often misunderstood by people. So consent is voluntary agreement. It has to be voluntary. People can't be forced into consenting to have sex. That's not consent. Any voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. So that this has to be affirmatively communicated. So an absence of saying no does not qualify as consent, or silence or passivity doesn't equal consent. So this can be done through words like saying yes, or through behavior or conduct. And important to know, people can consent to one type of sexual activity, but not to another. And having consented to one form of one type of sexual activity doesn't imply consent to all forms of sexual activity. So, people can consent to kissing or fondling, but not to having penetrative sex, or they may consent to having sex with a condom, but not to unprotected sex. So those are that's important. So again, so 4 important elements of consent are: it has to be clear, it has to be coherent, willing, and it has to be ongoing. So what do we mean by consent being clear? That it's actively expressed as a yes, and you can't just say, well, consent was implied, and not saying anything doesn't imply a yes. There has to be an affirmative show or expression of consent. So things like saying, I'm not sure, I don't know, maybe, that doesn't mean there's consent there. Another thing that consent has to be coherent. So that means that the person giving consent cannot be incapacitated by drugs or alcohol. If a person is, then they cannot consent to sex, because they can't make rational or reasonable decisions when they can't understand what's going on and what they're consenting to. Importantly, people who are asleep or in any other vulnerable position obviously can't provide consent. Another key element of consent is that it has to be willing. So it has to be given freely without the person feeling pressured to say yes. So there can't be any psychological or emotional manipulation or physical threat. And importantly, another thing that's important to say is consent can't be freely given, willingly given, when there are power dynamics or imbalances in a relationship. And like I said, it has to be also ongoing. So every time there is a new form of sexual activity, there has to be another asking of consent or making sure that consent is provided. So, sexual assault, we do think about the part around that's connected to sex, and so although sexual assault, there may be some sexual gratification that perpetrators get from sexually assaulting others. Really, sexual assault is more about power and an individual trying to exert power over another individual. And that can be through coercion or force. So one thing that makes people more at risk of experiencing sexual violence is this power imbalance that makes it harder for people to willingly to say no, or to not feel pressured, or that makes them be at more risk for exploitation, victimization. So people of marginalized identities face increased risks of sexual assault, we see, especially in places like Saskatchewan. But sexual violence, sexual assault doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen because someone wakes up one day and decides to go sexually assault their friend or coworker. Sexual assault is part of is more the tip of the iceberg of a broader context that facilitates this type of violence. Maybe this might be a new term to you, rape culture, but oftentimes one concept to understand all the other things that are below that, that make sexual violence possible, or make it so that people are sexually assaulted, are all the beliefs and all the ways in which we normalize forms of sexual violence. So that can be sort of normalizing rape jokes, or comments that blame victims, or having just sexist attitudes. The next level up from that, if you're looking at that pyramid, is degradation. So unsolicited dick pics, or catcalling, or stalking women, or stalking people, or sharing photos without the consent of the person. One level up is efforts to remove autonomy. So coercion, sexual coercion, threatening someone, groping, safe word violations. So that's where someone doesn't stop where there's been an agreement to when that person will stop, when there is a word that is, there's an understanding that that word will imply that there's no more consent. And also when people remove condoms to have unprotected sex when the person did not consent to that. And then we see at the top of that pyramid forms of explicit violence like gang rape, murder, molestation, rape, and interpersonal violence. So sexual assault and sexual harassment are only in the top of this pyramid, but there's a lot of other things in our culture and our society that make possible for perpetrators to get away with it, and for that to be normalized. Just a bit about the statistics. So in Canada, we know that 1 in 4 girls will experience sexual assault by the age of 18, and 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence, sexual assault over their lifetime. 1 in 6 boys will experience a form of sexual assault or sexual violence by age 18, and 1 in 5 over their lifetime. The thing that is particular to sexual assault is that might surprise some people is that in most of the cases, the person who commits the sexual assault is known to the survivor. That's in approximately 80% of sexual assault cases, there is a established relationship with the survivor. And one thing about Saskatchewan is that our self-reported rates of violence against women are double the national rate and the second highest in the country. And violence against women in northern Saskatchewan is among the highest in Canada as well. So sexual assault impacts everyone. It impacts women, men, gender nonconforming people, but not everyone equally. So we see 80% of people with disabilities will experience sexual violence. That's a particularly high percentage of people living with disabilities. LGBTQ two-spirit plus people are at elevated risk of sexual violence. Close to 50% of the trans community and 60% of bisexual women will experience sexual violence. And Indigenous women are sexually assaulted at 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous people because of social beliefs of, that's from a different that's a typo. So three times the rate of non-Indigenous sexual or non-Indigenous people. So that's really significant. That's one of the reasons why we see such high rates of interpersonal violence and sexual violence in northern Saskatchewan. So yeah, so again, like I mentioned earlier, sexual violence is obviously, it's about sex. There is an element of sex, but it's much more about power. And that's why we see people who have less power in our society being at higher risk of being sexually assaulted. So just quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, survivors face many barriers when trying to report sexual assault. So in particular, we see shame is a really normal emotional response to sexual assault. And one of the main reasons why people don't share their experiences, they don't report or disclose to other people what happened to them. Often survivors blame themselves or feel responsible for what happened to them. This is in part because of, as a culture, there is a lot of victim blaming in our society, in our culture. So people feel often a lot of shame, guilt, confusion. And there's also sometimes people are scared of being not believed, or they're embarrassed, or they are scared about engagement with the police or the justice system. They might have had previous negative experiences, or they're also just don't trust the justice system. Sometimes also because because 80% of survivors know they're the person who assaulted them. There's a lot of fear about how saying, this person assaulted me, how that might impact them socially or within their families. Another thing, we see that the low conviction rates and the lengths, how long a trial may take is another reason why people decide not to report. And just so you see just how few cases are actually ever reported, only about 5 to 8% of sexual assaults are reported to police. And false reporting, we know, is very low as well, only less than 5%, 2 to 4, which is similar to other crimes. And so if you see that the graph on the right, out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 33 are reported to the police. Of those 33, only 29 are actually recorded as a crime, and only 12 have charges laid. Of those 12 where there are charges laid, only 6 are actually prosecuted, and only 3 of those 6 ever lead to conviction. So that means that out of 1,000 sexual assaults, 997 perpetrators walk free. So that's another one of the major reasons why people don't report, is because it's a really, really painful process, and it's really, really difficult process. And in the end, the overwhelming majority of cases don't result in the perpetrator being held accountable. Yeah, so that's all I've got for today. If you have any more questions or want to contact the center, our information is there. You can also find more information about the services we provide on our website or on Facebook or Instagram.
Thank you so much, Moravia. Wow, so much great information for all of us, and so much detail. For breaking it down to the basics is super important. Just understanding what is consent and all of those things that we may think we know, but maybe we actually don't. So thank you so much for that. I see we're going to get right into the Q&A portion here. So I see a couple questions already. The first one's for Tmira, and this is from Marlene. Tmira, she's asking, what presentations or briefs have been made to the provincial government regarding funding for second stage housing for women escaping interpersonal violence? Is this an area that RAISER could support? Could we contact our own MLAs, cabinet ministers, and government officials with this request? Given the dire statistics regarding IPV in Saskatchewan, she can't believe, and I can't believe, that there is no provincial funding for second stage housing to keep women and families safe.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, man. I am the same way. So since I have been in this role as the ED of SOFIA House, I have indeed advocated to the provincial government. Every year I have a funding request. I have a funding request in right now. We have, involved media. We have very much been advocating for this issue. Both, myself at SOFIA House, PABS, our umbrella organization, and other second stage shelters and crisis shelters in Saskatchewan, because, there's such a link there and such a need there in the community. So yeah, very much, any support that we could get, very much we would take you up on your offer for RAISER to support us. That would be wonderful. I do think probably the best person to contact is the Minister of Justice. So I did have a meeting in June with the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Social Services, and the Minister responsible for status of women, where I just raised this issue again. And then I also asked, like, who actually owns this piece? Like, who am I to advocate to? I kind of need an answer, because this is a question that needs to be answered. And it was determined that it would be under the Ministry of Justice. So I don't know, after the election, if there's going to be a cabinet shuffle or what the situation will be, but the Ministry of Justice right now is to be responsible because they're responsible for the funding of the crisis shelters. That is where they determined that operational funding for second stage shelters would fall. So that's who you would advocate to. I will continue to do my part on advocating as well as our, our allies. So thank you very much for that offer.
Thank you so much, Tmira. Okay, we'll definitely keep that in mind for sure and look into that. And so the next question we have is for Stephanie, and it's along the same lines. So related to safe housing for women and their families experiencing IPV, is there any prioritization for women in these situations for low cost or social housing in Saskatchewan?
From what I know, so like most subsidized housing situations, the women must have children in their care, or there has to be like a reunification plan actively in place and happening in order for them to access subsidized housing. So like through the Saskatchewan Housing, Regina Housing, Namarand, Silver Sage, all those types of subsidized housing corporations. And there's usually higher requirements to access those types of housing as well, in terms of like financial checks and having to have their bills in order, which can be a huge barrier for women in accessing those. And we often have to help them jump through a ton of hoops to get into those types of housing. And I mean, so yeah, women with children are prioritized. We have seen cases where like our senior women that have come into the shelter, we're able to find them some subsidized housing, say through Milton Heights. It's like a housing, an apartment complex for varying needs and ages. Yeah, some of the senior women have been able to access subsidized housing through some of the other corporations I've mentioned as well before. But so one kind of big issue is there just isn't anything for single women who have complex needs and often find themselves in recurrent abusive relationships, recurrent homelessness and often face numerous issues in their lives that are preventing them from maintaining healthy relationships and safe housing. So there really is a lack of, there's no prioritizing really of women, single women who kind of meet that demographic. And so there's a gap there. And there's also another gap that's been identified more recently is families with pets in their care. That's going to be an issue that, like with the provincial association, is looking at more closely in the coming years. Women don't want to leave violent situations if their pets can't come with them, right? And so that can often be that's a huge barrier, you know. And so that's kind of, yeah, so prioritization is basically women with children, reunification plans in place for getting their children back, and that's about it. And being able to meet all the financial requirements and all the paper requirements to do so.
Thanks, Stephanie. Lots of great insights there and huge gaps, as we can see. Okay, so we have another question from Jackie. I think this is, for everyone, or I'm not sure if it's anyone specific, but if anyone wants to jump in, if we wanted to go upstream to prevent interpersonal violence, what factors would have the biggest impact? If anyone wants to jump in on that question.
I can start, and then Stephanie and Moira, you can jump in. So I think, we need to, there's a couple things. We need to look at our attitudes in society and the way that we view women and the value of women and children in our society. We need to look at, we're looking at some prevention techniques, but typically our system is very reactive. So we respond to issues once they happen, as opposed to focusing on preventative things, like teaching about IPV in school, teaching to young boys, teaching to young girls, and really backing it up so that people learn about healthy relationships, what is not a healthy relationship, and working to break those cycles. I don't know if Stephanie and Moira, you have any other comments on that?
I would just echo that. Yeah, one of the major one of the major ways of stopping interpersonal violence is through education around healthy sexuality, healthy relationships. We've been doing a lot of work in schools with one of our programs called Kids on the Block, where we teach children around consent using puppets, and it's a really effective program to engage with kids around these issues. So that's one major program that, and one major way in which we're trying to prevent sexual violence in Saskatchewan through education. But I think also, like I said, sexual violence and interpersonal violence doesn't just happen from in a vacuum or just out of nothing. It's really reinforced and strengthened by these broader societal and cultural attitudes and norms and the oppression of women and people with marginalized identities. So obviously those are bigger structures to address, but I think one major way of being an ally, especially to people with marginalized identities, is to continue to advocate and stand with them so that they can live lives free from violence.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Stephanie, did you have something to add?
Well, I was wondering if you want me to comment on the COVID question.
Yeah, I was going to get to that one next, definitely.
Oh, I thought that was okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
you're jumping the gun. You're right ahead of me here. So COVID related. So this one's from my mom, Gwen. So COVID is going to be a very long road, obviously, in disruption, and it has a negative impact, obviously, as we all know, on families. So what is your prediction? This is all three of you can comment about the impact to your organizations that COVID will have.
Seeing that I was already heading there. So I know already that it's reduced the amount of people we've been able to help because of restrictions on, so in order to try and promote social distancing in the shelter, trying to reduce contact, we've had to spread out. And so we are using, at any given time, we're using 5 of our 8 rooms, or technically housing, but actually it's strange. So right now we're using almost all of our rooms, but one family is using 3 rooms. So that's unusual, but normally we're using 5 of our 8 rooms at any given time in order to spread out. And then we're keeping people in hotels. We're using 2 hotel spaces at any given time, which is not ideal for especially families with kids. And it's not ideal for us to work with them. Most people do much better in the shelter environment. Mind you, we do find some people just don't do well in the communal environment, but for the most part, people do much better with the support, the more direct support of the shelter environment. So we're finding it very difficult to work with clients effectively when they are in the hotel, and we're finding that we end up needing, like, as soon as we can, we bring them to the shelter, and really that's when we're able to start doing more meaningful work with them. And but we know, based on the numbers that we've been able to help, we're just not helping as many people as we would in normal years, unfortunately. But we're still seeing, well, initially we saw fewer calls at the start of the pandemic. It was really eerie, and a lot of people, I think, were scared to come into a shelter environment or assumed that we weren't operating normally and things like that. So initially calls were down. That's not the case anymore. So demand has returned, but we're not able to meet the demand in the normal way. And initially, we also saw more severe cases of violence and sexual abuse because we had to prioritize those people over all others because of the reduction in space. We were only taking women where there was physical or sexual violence or a risk of physical or sexual violence at the start of the pandemic, just to ensure that they were getting spaces over all others. We've returned to a bit more normal, we returned to more normal intake, and in terms of the types of cases where we would typically take, but yeah, I mean, we know there's been lots of, I could go on for quite a long time about the impacts of COVID on how we've operated and on our clients and the families that we see, so.
I can go next, and I can echo kind of what Stephanie said as well. So at SOFIA House, because everybody has their own apartment, we don't have those restrictions in terms of the communal living, but we're seeing other challenges as well. Like I said earlier, we're seeing a huge demand for long-term and secure housing that we're not able to meet. So that's only going to increase during this pandemic. The worry is that if people don't have safe and secure and affordable housing, they will end up at friends or families that may not be safe. They could end up homeless during a pandemic. We're really nervous about that and what that looks like during COVID, and especially in the winter. So that's a huge concern for us. And then just with other nonprofits as well, like we have seen, donations go down because people aren't in a position where they're able to donate just because of the state of the economy. So for nonprofits that rely on donations, that's going to be a significant impact for us as well.
Yeah. For us, one of the major challenges has been taking people off of our wait list. We did close our office for about 3 months, and during that time we weren't taking new clients on. So what our wait list has grown a lot since this year in particular. And so it's been really a huge challenge to be able to continue to provide services to grow and to this growing wait list. So that's been one major impact, just not being able to. Now we are starting to take people off our wait list, but it took a while before we sort of stabilized and we're in that place to be able to do that as well. Most of our services are a mix of in-person and remote at this point. So some people accessing phone or video counseling, and some people coming in person. But for a while, we were only able to do remote counseling, and depending on where the numbers are here in Regina, we may at some point have to go back to that. But for now, we're still seeing some people in person. And we also have had to stop our groups because of restrictions around the number of people who can be in our office, and just our space is not always set up to be able to physically distance in the ways that we would want to, so that people are safe.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. Oh, what a tough time we live in. Hey. Ooh. Okay. Pam asks, Tmira specifically, you mentioned volunteers for the child programs. How else can volunteers be utilized in your house, and how do we volunteer?
So right now, the only volunteers that we are taking are for our children's program. So how you volunteer is, I'll just put my email in the chat here, and you can just contact me, and we can set you up with an interview, kind of explain a little bit more about what we do in our children's program. We do, it's kind of touch and go, like we are going ahead with our groups still. We have consulted with Saskatchewan Health Authority and kind of asked, should we still be going ahead? But because it's with residents that are, in the house and we're under kind of the number limit, we can still go ahead with our group. That might not always be the case, but for now we are going ahead with it. So I'll put my contact information in the chat, and you can contact me if you're interested. And I'm not sure if the other organizations have other volunteer opportunities as well.
Do any of the other two groups, Stephanie or Moravia, do you guys have volunteer opportunities at all?
Yeah, like I mentioned, our crisis line is one opportunity. If you're interested in becoming a volunteer for that, we're always accepting applications, and you can go on our website to read a little bit more and to download the application. And that is, again, answering our 24-hour crisis line and providing accompaniment to survivors to either to the hospital or to report at the police.
We also take volunteers for our children's programming that accompanies the outreach group, or to help mind children in the shelter when women need a break or when they need to get to appointments and things like that. We don't always have the staffing capacity to do that. We use volunteers as well, just to help do extra things around the shelter that staff don't have the time for, such as really exciting things like cleaning and yard work. Stuff that we do occasionally get people wanting to do stuff like that. So usually groups, and sometimes volunteering to help cook or prepare meals and bake for the clients is popular, especially at holidays. And yeah, I mean, we're not doing a lot of volunteers in the shelter at the moment. If people want to help, we are letting them come in, but we have to be mindful of, they need to be aware what kind of environment they're coming in. They might want to bring, extra precautions. And we have to be mindful of how many people we have in the building at any given time, how many extra people we're adding if we're bringing in volunteers to help at the shelter. The outreach group is a little different. We're able to spread out. We have a space that we use off-site that's huge, and we spread out a lot. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. Okay, we have 2 more questions, and that's probably all we have time for, unfortunately, but both are from Kiara. And so Kiara asks Moravia, there is a huge buzz in the media and on Instagram with regards to sexual harassment and assault in Regina recently. Do you think the accounts for sharing experiences of sexual violence publicly are beneficial for survivors in the healing process? And can they be re-traumatizing to survivors?
Thanks so much for that question, Kiara. Yeah, I think one of the main reasons why people felt so drawn to share their stories, like I said, was because so few people are report to the police. So, you know, and that's for a lot of different reasons. Like people don't feel comfortable, they maybe aren't ready. And so I do think that spaces where survivors can share their stories, especially on social media, can be really powerful spaces for survivors to find their voice, to feel like it wasn't just them, to start to kind of counteract some of the blame and judgment and shame that they may have felt, especially when they are able to share their stories anonymously. I think that gives some safety for sharing stories in ways that, you know, sharing your story with your name and face, or to people you know, or to loved ones, can be really particularly difficult. So definitely, I think for some people, those spaces in those communities can be spaces of empowerment. And for sure, for some other people, they could be very traumatizing or very triggering to read depictions of or stories about other people experiencing sexual violence. You know, we know that that it can be triggering, and it probably could have. There may have been people who were, you know, just scrolling on social media and who happened to be reading these stories without being ready or being in a, you know, in the right mindset to do it, or just sort of being maybe surprised or shocked by some of the details, or feeling like the details really resonated with their own experiences. And so for sure it can be traumatizing experiences for people to and also you know, sometimes avoidance is a powerful coping strategy for many survivors. So that's another way, you know, by kind of bringing up their stories and talking about their stories, it can bring up some emotions that they may not have been able to process, may not have all the resources to process in the moment. So for the people sharing their stories.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, the last question here is just also from Kiara. So she noticed, Moravia, you mentioned your work with immigrant women. So are there specific challenges or risks for this population in regards to IPV that are common?
Yeah, well, one of the maybe specific issues that specifically impacts immigrant women has to do with status, and oftentimes people's status, immigration status, can be linked to their abuser, their partner. Maybe they're being sponsored, or they're here as a spouse of someone with a work permit or something like that. So because of that, that makes leaving that relationship when there is abuse a little bit harder. There are newer initiatives that are trying to address that in terms of immigration status to try to reduce that barrier. But that's just from my experience. I don't know if Tmira or Stephanie want to share.
I would also add too that the the structural systems and the way that things are set up right now are really make it really difficult for immigrant women. So for example, you know, getting onto income assistance or something like that, you know, you need provincial ID, you need all of this documentation, and it's just such a hard road for immigrant women, and it requires a lot of advocacy to kind of figure that out and work through all of those systems. So that's a huge challenge that we are finding at our organization.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Tmira. And whenever we do, and we certainly do see those cases where women come into our shelter and they have zero status in the country. At some point along the road, they've lost their status that they maybe came in with for a number of reasons, and the person who brought them here is their abuser. So it makes it very complicated. It makes it, we know she's going to be with us much longer than a typical case, just because of all those barriers. And some other issues that we encounter are when there's a significant language barrier, finding translators within the community who don't know the woman and who won't report that she's staying at a shelter, or where the information won't get back about her leaving her husband and where she is. We've recently encountered even situations where, this is like a kind of a new one. So most of the cab drivers know where the shelters are. And we had a cab driver who was a partner that a woman was leaving, who knew another cab driver had told him that she had gone there and where it was, and then he was showing up, and we had to call the cab company and tell them what was going on. And I don't know if anything happened, but things like that, when those communities can be pretty small and tight knit, and it can be quite taboo to leave your husband, to leave your family for whatever reason. Very challenging.
Okay, thank you ladies so much. I think that's about all the time. We're a little bit over time, but lots of really nice comments in the chat here from many of our attendees tonight, just thanking you all for your insightful words and all the education that you provided us tonight. Special kiss to and hug to the little chickie over there that Talitha's holding for tuning in as well. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end things off by just asking each of you to do a quick plug for how we can donate, if you have any upcoming fundraisers or events that we can tune into, let us know what they are. And if you want to leave your email in the chat, I know Tmira already did, but if you want to do that for us to be able to reach out to you for more questions or information, feel free to do that as well. So let's start with Stephanie.
So we do have, we're going to try our own hand at a virtual event coming up on November 25th. And we haven't decided what it's called yet, but it will be, the intent is it's going to replace we typically hold an Eat and Empower lunch in the spring. And so we're going to have our speaker that was going to speak at that lunch speak at this online event over a lunch hour on November 25th. Coming up, so stay tuned for ads about that and how to purchase very inexpensive tickets. And we are on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And I can't remember what else you asked for. Just a fun, yeah, I guess so if you are ever interested in volunteering with us, we do have a specific person who coordinates the volunteers, but people are free to email me as well, and I can forward that information on to our shelter coordinator, and I will leave my email in the comment box as well.
Awesome, thank you. Tmira, do you want to go next?
Sure. So we actually have an online fundraiser going on right now. And actually all of the donations until the end of the month will be matched by Ivana, who is our expansion sponsor. So we are really, really thankful to them and for that. So we also have a new Instagram. It's SophiaHouse.Regina. We have a Twitter as well, which is SophiaHouse _YQR. And I can put them in the chat or email them out. And then we also have a Facebook page. So the link for our online donations will link you to the Canada Helps website, and you can donate on there. So that is kind of the best way right now with our current online fundraiser. And again, I left my email in the chat, so if anyone wants to connect with me, please do.
Perfect. Moravia?
Yeah, we are organizing an event for Victims of Crime Awareness Week, which is November 23rd, I believe, the week of November 23rd. The date is still to be determined, but I'll share that information with Talitha and Skylar when we have that available. So that'll be an online event as well. And if people are interested in volunteering or donating, you can find more information on our website, and I'll make sure to include that with my contact information in the chat. And you can also find our social media links to follow us on social media there as well.
Sounds great. All right. Well, that wraps our evening and our event this evening. So thank you all for tuning in. We wish you a safe rest of your week, and enjoy what's left of this October, hopefully nice October weather. See you all.